Thank you all very much for being here and talking to me today about casting. Um, would you mind briefly introducing yourself and saying what you do, essentially? Abby, if you want to go first.
Cool. Hi. So I'm a casting associate, and I currently work with Jess Renane, and we work on quite a few projects, mostly based on kind of medium of theatre. We work at the Old Vic. We work on Matilda the musical, and then a few other projects as well. So there's a real kind of variety. And I've worked with her for a while, so about 5 years.
I'm Kat, and I work at Jane, and I'm a casting assistant in the office. And yeah, I've been there about a year and a half.
I'm Nick. I actually originally started in casting at that same office, but left probably it'll be 2 years ago in September, and I worked in a few offices since, in some TV and film, and most recently moved back into theatre and musical theatre in Jill Green's office. So I'm one of her casting assistants.
Amazing.
So I've kind of, so I didn't necessarily plan to go into casting. It was something that I always wondered about and was quite interested in. But I studied at Central School of Speech and Drama, which is kind of the big focus of Central is acting, but there's some really brilliant theatre practice courses. So I did the BA Theatre Practice. And when I was there, I kind of thought I wanted to maybe produce or direct or work in some kind of arts organisation, then kind of administrative behind the scenes sense. And when I was in my third year, we were able to take on kind of placements and internships. And I found out through a friend who was also at Central about just looking for an intern on Matilda for a kind of 8-week period. And so I applied for that, and then went and worked with her while I was still studying, kind of doing my dissertation. And then it was kind of right place, right time. As I graduated, there was the company was kind of developing, and there was a role that became available to me. And then I've stayed there ever since. It's a really varied, interesting place to work, and there's been quite nice progression for me and just works on really interesting projects. So I've kind of worked up from intern to assistant, and then now I'm an associate of hers.
So I initially went to Kent University, and I did a lot of acting, but in my third year I did a year abroad, and I was able to sit in on a casting session for one of the local artistic directors, and that's, I think, when I first started thinking about casting. And then when I graduated, I did what I think a lot of people do who know they want to work in theatre but they're not kind of quite sure where they fit yet. Tried to get all sorts of different experience. I did a bit of marketing, a bit of producing for theatre, and then I was still looking for casting opportunities, and I happened to have a chaperone license, and I did a bit of chaperoning for Matilda and School of Rock, and then it just happened that a position had come up, and I went for it, and yeah, so I've mostly been working on Matilda and School of Rock with the team.
I studied at University College London. I got a degree in archaeology and anthropology for my sins, but because I was studying in London, I actually was able to work kind of as a runner or sometimes in a chaperone role on a lot of those kids' shows for a long time. I originally met actually Jess on the other side of things because I did some work as a child, and that's how I was able to kind of do a lot of that when I was a teenager, which was really great. And I quite quickly learned I was not very good at acting, but really enjoyed the other side, and particularly working with children, even though I wasn't that much older than one myself. And yeah, I then ended up in a full-time role there after my degree, which was very good timing, just because something opened up, and loved being in that office. I'm very grateful. to have been there, and then decided I wanted to do a bit more television and film, to kind of just explore and learn what that side of things was like. And was very lucky to work with a brilliant casting director called Rose Wicksteed, who was very kind and generous. And then I kind of decided that television and film wasn't for me for various reasons, and I wanted to go back into theatre. And as luck would have it, went straight into something with Jill Green, who's another really fantastic role model and idol.
Thank you. All of you guys essentially ultimately work for a casting director. That's, you know, you're, whether you're freelance or sort of full-time employed, that's kind of the structure, as I understand it. I just thought it might be interesting to chat a little bit about the difference, kind of day-to-day / big picture, on what a casting director job is and what a casting assistant or associate job is, and how those two things work next to each other.
I think it depends. I mean, it differs in different offices, and different offices work differently. I think there are similarities in lots. I think the main thing is the casting director, if it's a busy office and there are lots of projects on, typically they spend most of their time in auditions, and that's where the onus is on them. And in managing the relationships between the creatives and the casting director, I think it's a very important part of that job, which is slightly different to the support as a casting assistant or an associate. Most of the work is actually getting that all to happen and the logistics of that. It's a lot of time talking to agents, which sometimes casting directors, if they're in auditions all day, won't have the time to do, and agents' assistants in particular. And it's doing a lot of the logistics. So sometimes you're lucky enough that you don't need to sort out audition venues and things like that. Sometimes on some shows, actually, it does fall to the casting office to get all of that side of things, make sure it's all in place, ensuring the day runs smoothly. On some shows, I've been lucky enough that we actually have a stage manager at the auditions, but if not, the casting assistant will often do that role. So run people to the room, make sure everything sort of runs smoothly and the actors are happy. If anybody's running late, really boring things like that. And yeah, kind of just being really, really hot administratively as well is a huge part of the role, which almost always falls to the assistants and the associates, just because casting directors are in auditions too much. Sometimes, I mean, I think this is true for all of us, but if there's a few projects going on, it's impossible for a casting director to be in more than one place. So we'll cover different sets of auditions on the same day, which is a real perk of being a casting assistant, I think, being in the room if there's the time. It's just often the office hasn't got enough workers to be able to support that. So sometimes somebody just has to be in the office in order to get the next day or the next week up and running.
I mean, obviously it depends office to office, and if you have sort of maybe an early career casting director who's just made that step, then they would be doing a lot of the stuff that Nick's just described that an assistant would be doing. So I think it kind of depends where they're at. But yeah, I think I would say, I mean, we're quite lucky, I think, in the office we all have come up in, that we do have input in some ways that I think not all offices do have. So whilst I think a casting director role is more creative and maybe assistant associates are more organisational, I think it does just depend on the office.
Yeah, no, I totally echo what all of you, both of you have said. I think also in terms of the whole process of casting something, I would say that, I mean, we're always kind of facilitating, so always supporting and facilitating for the casting director role. But a lot of the time that will start from the very beginning. So we'll be doing, like, certainly in our office, we do quite a lot of research, and you know, if we're looking for quite a niche role, we'll be doing kind of research documents, putting long lists together, under, you know, got a lot of guidance from the casting director. But you know, it's such a big task to pull something like that together. The kind of initial work might be done by the associate or the assistant to kind of throw the net as wide as possible, and making sure no kind of stone is left unturned. And the same thing, you know, in terms of an associate role, I run quite a lot of sessions that are kind of initial sessions. So the kind of first look at things. So particularly in the kids stuff, we'll run kind of preliminary rounds, and then Jess would get involved sort of later on. But she's kind of, the casting director will tend to be across everything the whole way through, but it's just where you're focused and go, because it's a full-on process.
Yeah, amazing. I think something I feel like I've observed, working with you guys and watching you work, is for such a massive job, casting offices are often just such a small team relative to it. There's the director and maybe an associate and maybe an assistant, and sort of like 3 people is a big casting office type thing. And so I suppose hopefully what it means for you guys is, because there's so much work, you maybe get an opportunity to do more work and take on more responsibility than something like a production office where there's probably 8 to 10 of us.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'd definitely say so. And because you tend to be a smaller team, you get a real overview of the process. You're not kind of locked out from any areas, even when you're supporting like we are. You still get a chance to be kind of across things, and you have to be across things, and kind of especially it's a really nice opportunity to be able to kind of see a process from start to finish and document it all, because that's a big part of our role, kind of making sure we know where we're at, like who's met on each project, who we've considered, who we've offered to, and making sure it's all really well documented. And I don't know, you might not have that in another office if you're very strict on your responsibilities. Yeah.
You get to learn very quickly in that environment, I've definitely found, because it is just a case of you're learning something as you're doing. I mean, I know it's kind of obvious, but you're learning something as you're doing it for the first time, because like there's no one else to do it. So it's okay. It's not a case of, okay, like let's, obviously you rely on the sort of how thorough the people that have come before you are, and like we're very lucky in that respect. Everything's laid out very clearly, but yeah, I definitely have found that the environment means you get to learn very quickly about lots of different things.
This next question is purely for my own benefit, and if it is worth very little time, then please give it very little time. But before I worked in theatre professionally, I spent a long time, and I still hear other people doing this, referring to the role of, I suppose, a casting director as a casting agent. And I don't know where that comes from, and I just wanted to know if any of you guys know why that's a thing, or if is it just because casting is such a mystery even within the industry. I don't know.
It's bizarre. It's very strange, but it happens a lot, and it has happened for a long time. It still happens. I've never known anyone who's worked in casting who's been able to explain it. I think there is an element of mystery in casting, which is also bizarre. I think it's actually just because, like you said, there's so much work that has to be done that we actually don't have time a lot of the time to spend with people and explain what we do. In and out of the industry, I think it's not always that well known what a casting process entails from beginning to end.
Yeah.
So I think that is my only explanation. People just don't know because we don't have the time to tell them.
Yeah, and I think there's something in there's casting, and then there's the role of casting director, and then there's the role of agent. So like an actor's agent or a talent agent. And sometimes I think people just sort of marry them together somehow. The other thing is, I guess perhaps it comes from the US a bit, because I think there's kind of bigger casting director kind of groups there. They're not in such a kind of boutique. They don't cast in, I don't know a lot about it, but it's not as boutique.
Yeah.
So I think it might be more of an agency, because I guess a casting office could also be referred to as a casting agency.
This is the same for everyone in theatre, because no day is the same. But could you guys give me a sort of glimpse into a typical day in a casting office? Some things that might include.
Yeah, It's been so long since we've had a typical day, hasn't it?
There is that.
Yeah, which is where, I mean, I think, yeah, it kind of depends where you're at in the process, I would say, in terms of the process of casting something. But yeah, we'd always start with like a bucket of coffee. Very important.
Yeah.
And then it kind of depends really. I mean, I'm sure every office is really different, but we tend to have a kind of meeting, or we'll collate a bit of a plan for that day, with sort of things that we want to get through, and then we'll circulate that or discuss it with the rest of the team just to make sure we're kind of on the same page. And it can be anything from doing research, or putting breakdowns out, say on Spotlight, if you're kind of searching for a role. It can also be booking in for auditions, so contacting agents, and actually before booking in for auditions, it would be kind of checking availability, checking actors, booking in for auditions. Some days we'll have kind of full days where we're not in the office and we are just in auditions all day. And then there's a whole process after the audition, which would be kind of uploading any footage, if there's footage from the days, rounding up to teams. So there's quite a lot of, you want to make sure the team are really aware of people in the mix for each role, and discuss, summarising discussions, and then that way. And I know that's kind of like the whole process. That isn't necessarily a typical day, but it really varies because it just depends where you are in a process. You'd never really have like a month of doing the same thing every day. You'd always hope there would be moving on. But yeah, what about you guys? Do you think someone else?
Yeah, I think it's just I mean, you kind of already said it, but it's like, if anyone wanted to know what we do every single day, and that's just lots of emails, which is probably similar to a lot of people in office-based theatre jobs. And then beyond that, like Abby was saying, kind of depends where we're at. I mean, when I was in the office recently, I spent a lot of time going out to showcases, because that's the sort of time of year when a lot of those were happening. Also doing a lot of the kids stuff. It could be going out on visits to different theatre schools. So it kind of just depends on what the work is in that particular office. I know, Nick, also you do quite a few, or you have done quite a few theatre visits, depending on different projects you're working on at Roses.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a different, just a different part of the process. So the big difference is if there's auditions that day or not, and then whether or not what your role is going to be at those auditions. So it might be that you're at your own day of auditions, which means running it under your own steam. Normally that's because the casting director's in different sets of auditions, which is really exciting. And then the other side is that office side of things. The dream is in an office where actually you've got 2 days of auditioning happening at the same time, and you can kind of swap with an assistant who takes those other sessions. That tends to work quite well, because then you're balancing the amount of administrative work with the auditions. You're both getting time in the room, and you're both across all of the admin as well, and able to do that and work in a synchronized way.
So obviously privacy permitting, but I wondered if you guys could share a sort of outstanding memory, a particular story perhaps, from your time in casting so far. Kat, do you want to kick off?
I think one that stands out for me, I can't remember at which stage we were in the process on Matilda, but there was a really special moment when we were at this point auditioning just for the role of Matilda, and it was at the end of a long day, and we were at Paddington Arts, and we were in, if you've ever been there, we were in the room, and their Matildas started singing. It started raining just as they started singing, and if you have been there, you'll know the roof is glass, so you can like see everything. And it was just like a really nice moment, because the song, it just kind of fit. It was just like an atmospheric thing, so that was really nice. And then I think just every time the kids come out and bow on their, like, because they're just, especially on School of Rock, they're absolutely rocking out and having the time of their life. So that's always quite special for me to see, quite rewarding.
Nice. Abby?
Yeah, I mean, mine was similar with the Matilda. I'm just like, it's really bad, but I have a real kind of tendency to well up every time Matilda and the company takes their bow at the end of the show, particularly on the first night, because I think it's always, you know, they go through such a process and they learn so much when they're in that show, and they work incredibly hard. And so you just see the kind of culmination of all of that, and it is really amazing to watch. And yeah, I would say, you know, anything. I think the really nice thing about this job is you do get to see the kind of the culmination of it all, and you know, especially on shows that you've had maybe 2 or 3 workshops of, and that have really been developed from scratch, and you've gone through a massive process, and you know, there've been ups and downs, kind of seeing the end product, even if there are flaws and even if there are kind of, you know, things that have gone different ways, it's really, really rewarding to see that. You know, projects like Girls from the North Country that we did at the Old Vic, it were kind of in process for a long time before they became a kind of final thing. And it's just, yeah, it's so amazing to see all the creatives kind of grouped together and the collaboration that happens.
Yeah, loads of like similar answers. I think something that I found really special and can in no way take full credit for or much at all, but being a part of the process of casting the first female drummer in School of Rock was really special. And not only slightly having to pull the team uphill to be open to it, but actually carrying it all the way through and ensuring that she went on stage and girls could go and see that show and think, actually, it's not just bass I'm going to be playing. Felt like an actual, you know, it felt like important. And I think that's probably one of my biggest highlights.
So we kind of touched on the fact that you guys all came into a similar role in very different ways. So I suspect similarly, moving forwards can also look lots of different ways and there's lots of different routes. But again, maybe a sort of estimate or typical progression in casting, kind of from where you are. Maybe you could chat a bit about what that looks like for most people. Nick?
Okay, I think, well, there were kind of 2 questions there. So the first one is like how you get into casting. We all came from very different places to end up in not entirely dissimilar places. And I think there is no uniform route. I know there is some form of university qualification that's in progress. A couple of casting directors are talking to an education about that being a route, which I think is really exciting and will only lend credit to the industry and the profession.
National Film and Television School that are doing it. Yeah,
and I think G&J is doing it with another. Yeah, which is really, really exciting. And hopefully that will become a sort of uniform way to go in. And the people who go on that course are going to be a million times better at that job than we are. But such is life. In terms of progression through it, I think it's a lot of, it does require a lot of patience. It's not an easy job. It's very long hours, but if you're wired slightly wrong, which we all are, it's extremely rewarding. and
Yeah.
somehow worth it. It can be very punishing at times being an assistant, but I would say always worth it. And then as time goes on, and especially if you build a relationship with a casting director and work with them for a long time, like Abby has, you move into that associate role, which has similar, if not more challenges. And as you work with lots of different creative teams, if you're very lucky, you might get asked to do a project on your own. I did two. One which was I was the children's casting director, which sadly was supposed to be happening this summer, but then it got cancelled at Grange Park Opera. And then one which was adults, which was a brilliant play in Finsbury Park, which is really exciting. And I don't expect I'll have time to do any more of those this year or maybe even next year, but I guess the progression that most people do is building up those small things until you find a big thing. And that can either be whilst working with a casting director, lots are very happy for you to take on your own work, as long as you're able to still manage the rest of the job. And in some offices, it ends up being two casting directors together. So if you're there for a long time, you can have two casting directors in the same office, and then actually you can share your support, i.e. assistants and people who will hopefully come out with brilliant qualifications.
Abby, anything to add?
I think that's very thorough, and I totally agree. I think, yeah, I'd say very similar. And I think, you know, progression is a mixture of kind of learning skills that are required to do the job, but also developing kind of a taste and developing, you know, it takes a long time, I find anyway. For me, it's taken me a long time to kind of build taste and sort of, you know, also build the kind of encyclopedic knowledge that casting directors have. And I'm certainly, you know, you're always learning, and you know, you can look at casting directors and be like, oh my, you know, that they have such a knowledge, and that's kind of that's the goal. But I think everyone is always learning, and you're always, you know, there's always someone interesting that you might not have heard of. So I think progression might look like kind of just, it's not really like a set thing that would progress you. It's just constantly you're kind of building and learning, and that can be from kind of working with different people, both casting directors, but also working with different directors and on different projects and different kind of mediums. You know, it can be very different working in kind of theatre to more screen-based projects. So yeah, progression. I think it's, yeah, there's lots of different routes, but it's just continually kind of chipping away and learning as much as possible.
Kat, anything further?
No, I think it's pretty much all been covered. The only thing would just be the difference, I guess, in being a caster into being freelance at the very start of your career, and how that changes your progression, and whether that means you're going and working for a lot of different casting directors in different mediums, or if you're staying with one and, like these guys have said, sort of progressing that way. I think it's probably something that all people who work in casting will get to a stage where they have to think about going. Ultimately, if you become a casting director, you are working for yourself. So yeah, that's the only thing
This is one that's less about the kind of day-to-day and the job itself, and more in the basis, as I said, casting is a little bit of a mystery sometimes in the industry. And I just find it interesting, as far as I'm aware, feel free to correct me, but the job of, say, a casting director, for example, didn't always exist in the same way that, you know, actors and directors and writers and so on have kind of been around forever. Is that right? Is there any kind of like background to why casting exists and how it came about that you guys know of?
As far as I know, the job has always been done, but it hasn't always been done by somebody called a casting director. Also, actually, casting director, I know a lot of people would call themselves, but one thing that I always think is interesting is on American projects, you'll always see it's casting by, rather than casting director, which is the more normal way that British casting directors are credited. And I think that was to do with the Directors Guild or equivalent in America objecting to the fact that they don't think they don't think casting directors deserve a director credit, which I always think is somewhat petty. But as far as I know, a lot of it used to be done by producers' assistants and directors' assistants. I think it's only been around for about 60 years-ish, something like that. And a lot of the best casting directors are actually, especially some of the ones who are a little bit older, are some of the first casting directors, and definitely some of the best. Especially if you look in America, a lot of those old Hollywood casting directors are some of the original, they sort of paved the way for the industry. And I think it's a fairly female-led and dominated industry, which is great. And I can't remember who I was talking to, but somebody said part of that originally, and why a lot of those older casting directors are women, comes from the fact that it was assistants who started doing that role, and then it turned into its own industry. I don't know how much truth there is in that, but it seems to make superficial sense.
Yeah, it makes sense, and it is a nice thing to think, at least. Obviously, what most of you guys are talking about are really large-scale, big commercial productions, either in theatre and television, film, and so those productions all account for casting and essentially budget for someone specifically to do that job. But in small productions, in fringe theatre and so on, often there's no budget for it, and it's sort of maybe sometimes considered an unnecessary expense, and sort of a job that can maybe be done, I suppose, by the director or the writer.
Is that sometimes if a project, I mean, it's a little bit old-fashioned, I don't know how much it still happens. I know it does still happen. Rather than actually having a casting director or a casting team through the whole process, some people still actually buy lists. So they'll just get a casting director to send them a list of actors. Sometimes they check them, sometimes they don't. And they'll be paid for that, obviously not as much as doing the whole process. And then, if it's a smaller fringe company, then their production assistants or whoever will facilitate that process and sort of do their version of casting rather than having the whole team all the way through. So you can buy lists, but I think that's going out of fashion a bit now.
Yeah, I'd actually never
I've
heard
never
of
done
that.
There's definitely a kind of there's like a kind of.
Well, it's better to have a casting director the whole way through, for sure.
Yeah.
I think it's starting to have a bit more of a presence in the industry, a bit more of a voice. There's more networks and platforms coming up for the role to be represented as what it is and its own thing, rather than an additional thing just for big companies.
I think there's a misconception that that anybody can do it, in the sense that anybody can look at an actor and tell if they're good or not, and that's like the whole job.
Right.
Whereas it, like, as we, kind of other questions has prompted and what we've been talking about is that it's so much more than that. So I think that's probably, there's an element of that to it. And also I think you're talking about fringe theatre. I think probably, like, obviously there are budget of probably subsume it into the producer role, if not the producer and director collaboration, which I think, I find it understandable that people, fringe directors coming through, they probably can't afford to ask for help in that way. But I think there's a difference between that and people thinking, like you said, that it's not necessary, like, on the whole.
Yeah. And the other thing to say is, I think there are some bits that there's some amazing producers and directors who do know a lot about actors, and they've worked with plenty of actors. Like I'm definitely not afraid to say that there are directors that I've worked with who I'm like, their knowledge is absolutely amazing of actors, and you know, I'm in awe of them because they just have like a total understanding, which is kind of part of their job. So you know, I think it does depend, and I think maybe that's where it comes from sometimes. You know, if you are a producer who's very very educated and in terms of, you know, and seen a lot of actors and kind of has a really strong taste, then maybe that's the reason why you might, you know, if you've got not as much budget, you might kind of look to go that way.
Yeah.
Going back to what you said there, it's a really exciting time for casting, and the recognition is growing. People are finally starting to understand what they do and how they do it and why they do it as much as possible. This year was the second year of the Casting Directors Guild's Awards, which I think is a really important process, because I mean, it seems silly to want awards, but actually it's all a part of that getting recognised process.
You guys make a valid point that some producer director teams maybe don't necessarily need it, need someone else to fulfill that role, although that's unusual, and the budget is always an issue. But where you guys are working and are present, I think not being overlooked is important. So kind of the opposite of an earlier question about people that you work with all the time, and maybe an opportunity for you guys to ask a question instead of me grilling you. Is there any particular area or role in the industry that casting sort of never works with and never kind of crosses over, and that you maybe feel is a bit of a mystery, in the way that some people feel about casting?
Yeah, I think it's funny because it's such a for the section of the creative process that you're involved with, you're totally in amongst it. You're kind of dealing with these amazing minds and producers and you're kind of very much involved in that process. But then there does tend to be that, you know, there's a whole side that we then don't see, which is the kind of the creation, you know, in the rehearsal room or on set, where, you know, we might do visits to set, or we might kind of get the chance to have a look at rehearsals or have a look at any showings that they're doing. But you know, there's a whole kind of technical side that's really interesting to me as well, and the art that goes into that as well. You know, so even like, I don't know, there's so much really, like, you know, especially in terms of like the actual tech, like the get-in and all of that, that process. So definitely roles within that, in terms of kind of very practical roles. We do kind of deal with production managers quite a bit, but I think more kind of, you know, sound designers and lighting designers and then people who are kind of fully immersed in that side of the tech would be really interesting to talk to you further.
Something that I actually have never, and I've I mean, I don't know whether I'd put a role to it, but, you know, at uni or whatever, I've been a stage manager or production manager or whatever. Professionally, I find that role really interesting because of how many roles within it. I think you sort of look at it and you go, okay, he's a stage manager, but what's the difference between an ASM and a DSM and the people who are there during the rehearsal process and them on the production? I think I'd find that really interesting to know.
I can wonderfully plug that I do have a stage management video that goes into detail on those roles. So that's
amazing.
Well done. Nick, do you have anything on that?
Same really. I mean, it is. Abby kind of touched on it. Quite a frustrating part of our job is the fact that once a show's cast, it doesn't always happen, but quite often we're just completely cut out of communication thereon, and trying to be kept in that loop is really frustrating, and we sometimes seem like stalkers on our own shows, which is weird, but we need to be in on that information. And on some shows, you know, all shows have show reports every night, and sometimes you have to actually say, no, our office needs to be on that, because if somebody gets injured, I think people forget that we're the people who have to replace them. And sometimes, you know, casting decisions are made after a show is cast. People will change tracks, things like that. And sometimes we're not told about that, which is really frustrating. It feels like you have to constantly knock on the door and say, keep me included. But there's loads of that. We never see any filming really, unless you're lucky enough to do a set visit. But all things like that would be fascinating. But we're always in auditions. You know, once we cast something, the way that it works is because it's not the most well-funded industry. You do just have to cast something else straight away, and often 2 or 3 things at the same time. So it would be a real luxury to get to see more insight. I think a rehearsal room and watching the growth of the people you've put together and see those relationships form, that would be something I would find fascinating, because we normally just see first preview when all the hard work's been done.
Yeah. So we have already touched on it a bit, but I just wondered if there was anything else in particular that you wanted to mention, probably mostly yourself, Nick, or if you guys have any questions, that's about the differences working in film and television casting, and how much does the role adapt to that?
One of the big differences, well, I mean, okay, there's lots of little differences. One big one is volume, and prior to everything that's going on at the moment, the role of self-taping in that process. I know that in theatre it's definitely happening more and more, especially with what's going on. But typically the first step in a TV process, just because that's the way it is a self-tape. Obviously with bigger actors, they come straight into the room and you do them then, although actually often big actors will prefer to do a self-tape in the first instance because it actually makes life easier for everybody. And also you normally only work with one actor at a time. One other thing that's slightly different as a casting assistant is, well, and just generally for TV, often you won't have the director in the room with you. And you'll probably tape a lot more actors, I would say, for TV than you would for theatre. Sometimes that's because you've got more time, and there is more money, so that allows you more time on a project. Often the development stage is longer in television, which also gives you more time. And then when it comes to actually physically being in the room, it's often, I mean, I was very lucky to be able to spend a lot of time in the room with actors on my own, because Rose is brilliant and trusted me a lot and was very generous with that. And you have a lot of creative input in their tapes. So we would do a few different versions, and rather than having in theatre, you always have a director or an associate director and somebody to sort of tell them how to act and what they're looking for. Whereas in television, actually a lot of that falls to the casting director, certainly for the first couple of stages. And often we will send footage and then they might, you know, we might get feedback, whether it's from elsewhere in the UK or Europe or America. Often in that office, they might say, okay, we want to get them to retape, but you know, we'd like to see a bit more of this. And then we're the ones who in the room have to get that out of them, which was really exciting actually, and a huge learning curve if you've never done it before, and having the confidence to tell a very experienced jobbing actor to do something slightly differently definitely requires a high level of diplomacy.
And do you think there is, because we've talked a little bit briefly about the differences in kind of, or maybe like haven't discussed it, but like noted that there are differences between UK and US casting. But in the same way, like, I don't know whether this is more of a US thing with all the networks they have up there, but on doing TV stuff, have you found that there are more sign-offs that you have to get on who is ultimately cast?
Yes. I mean, it never quite happens this way, but in theatre there can be more of a vibe and a tendency. So almost once the actor's gone out the door, if they're the right person for the role and you're lucky enough to have the team with you, you can almost go, right, done, that's it, book him now. And in TV that never happens because you have to get it approved by so many different people. So, and actually we're, as always, kind of more facilitators in that process. I think people think, you guys might disagree with me on this completely, but people tend to think casting directors have the final say, and that is, I mean, in my experience, that's never happened. Our job kind of is, by the time we get to a final audition, to make sure that we are happy and proud for any of those people to be cast, and then it's the team's decision to sort of fight out the pros and cons, and we can obviously advise on character and do reference checks, just to see if anybody's personality has been problematic before. Yeah, so you have to get it approved, not by us, but ideally first the director, and then the producers, and then the network producers, if it's a big show, you know, if it's for like Fox 21 or something like that. The writers have to approve of it, and it all kind of happens in stages. And then once all of that's happened, which normally takes about, well, it can take months. Sometimes if it's between a couple of actors, they'll do crumbs. What do you call it? Tests? Screen tests. So they might fly an actor out to America to do, you know, they might fly 2 out and then basically get them to do a bit of it, and then, you know, then they have their decision. Sometimes you can do a screen test and actually they decide we don't want any of them, even though all these other people approved it. You know, anybody along the line can say, oh no, I don't really, I'm not feeling it. Yeah, it's a really long process, and then you get into contracting, which is another whole.
That as well. Yeah.
Lots of casting offices don't do that. I think it's something that's being palmed off onto casting offices more. I think you have to be very firm these days not to end up basically negotiating the contracts. And some casting directors are definitely more experienced at that than others. But that whole process is something I find very challenging. Talking to an agent and sort of actually having to hash out the logistics of, and all of the terminology that comes along with that, like a honey wagon, which is the type of dressing room they have, I think. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that you get involved with, and lots of numbers and percentages and distribution, all that sort of thing, which casting assistants can look through and learn from the process, but that's really casting director type of work, looking through those, and there's a lot of pressure on that, and if there's any mistakes on anybody's side, heads will roll, and casting director often get a lot of stick for that, in my experience.
The only other thing I was going to say, and I've got a lot more experience in theatre, but perhaps also when you are auditioning, I think there's a lot more crossover than there would have been previously. But in terms of the actors, the skills of an actor can be sometimes a little bit different. So, like, for example, in theatre, quite a lot of emphasis, especially somewhere like the Old Vic, we do look at voice quite a lot, because obviously it's really important to have actors that can, you know, potentially have experience, or you know, are used to filling a 1,000-seat venue, in terms of vocally, but it can probably work the other way in terms of the style of actor for screen work. But I think there is a lot more crossover than there used to be. Definitely, and I wouldn't say that you're one, you know, you fit in one box or the other, but I would say that there are you know, some actors who tend to suit a medium quite a lot, and would kind of go up for things more like that. Yeah,
I think especially that we're more interchangeable than I imagine they are in other places, just from other sort of conversations that I've had. I think having been in the US for a year and hearing them talk about their industry as well was interesting. I know there's been lots of conversations happening about the theatre currently, and them calling on the screen industry to support them, because a lot of our great actors do start in theatre and then move across and then continue to move back and forth. So I think we're quite lucky where we are that does happen a lot more.
I think it's kind of impossible to not talk about the fact that right now theatre and film and television and everything is just essentially on hold, which is very hard for all of us. But perhaps the silver lining is that we are having conversations that we would never normally have the time for. We are considering the fact that we have an opportunity to restart in a different way. And so something I'm asking everyone that I'm doing these conversations with is there sort of one thing that when you go back to work, you would hope to see perhaps development or change in your area, from the practical to the kind of big picture ideal? Time, pause for thinking, because it's a big question.
Yeah.
I think, and I've seen a number of articles or people talking about this online, and I think there is a concern that emerging artists are going to be sidelined for a while. So I think it's going to be really interesting to maneuver through that and put in place things that mean that those people at the very start of their careers aren't losing opportunities. That would kind of be the main thing for me, and kind of with that, just ensuring that we don't lose momentum in the direction we were headed, in terms of just particularly in our job, seeing the widest possible range of people that we can.
Yeah, I think that's, I totally agree with that, and I've got very similar points. But I think in terms of telling stories and representing the widest selection of people and diversities, I think just continuing to push with that at the forefront of everything.
The only thing I would add is just going back to the original thing, which is everyone's talking. So things like this, which didn't really happen before, all of the spotlight one-to-ones, we're through Jill's office, we're also talking to some people just separately, actors who are contacting in, and some graduates. We chatted to a college cohort who have all missed their showcases. We collated the CDG graduate database. Andrew in our office did that, which is a huge amount of work. But all of those showcases that were missed is now a resource. So all of those grads can be watched by all of the casting directors, which is brilliant. And things like that, I think, maybe will start to happen more often, especially because it's not always easy to get to them all. So a resource like that is really worth its weight in gold. I think calls like, I think some of you guys have listened to them, but the Society of London Theatre, the SALT calls, which have been happening sort of sporadically throughout this. Julian talks a lot about the ecology of theatre and the whole industry, not just theatre, the whole sort of creative arts industry. And that being open and specifically to casting, people feeling like we're approachable. You know, again, I'm lucky enough in Jill's office that we actually are able to respond to anybody who writes in, assuming they're specific in what they want. Obviously, if they're just telling us their life story, there's not a huge amount that we can do with that. But people feeling that they can approach us, actors who either don't have representation or, you know, might be looking to change or anything like that, them feeling like they can reach out to us directly is great. People who might be looking to get into the industry, who can sort of contact and get a bit more information about what that means. I think the open lines of communication is definitely as open as they've ever been. And I think that's something that would be really exciting moving forward. And it also comes with, you know, recognizing that casting is actually a foundation of the ecology of the whole industry. And as important as actors and agents and producers, and that feeling of that we're approachable. I think one piece of advice we've been giving a lot of actors at the moment is when you go into an audition room, don't feel like it's that feeling of us and them. It's actually much more of a circle. You know, sometimes logistically you do have to have a long table because you've got all the CVs and all of the different material that you just have to have in the room with you. And unfortunately, you do end up sitting on the other side of it. But actually it is a circle, and that rehearsal pianist, and, you know, if you've got a choreographer in the room, anything like that, they're all on the same team and you're all trying to make something together. And sort of actors getting that message in a time like this, I think, is brilliant for when things start up again, because there's going to be a lot of really exciting art that happens, and that will be much easier if actors are sort of more aware of that, and an openness moving forward would be really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely. And the only other thing I was going to say about the kind of the joining, on the same kind of note of people collaborating and joining together and supporting each other, is the kind of relationship within the casting world, but within the whole process, and the whole form. But you know, the how theatre and screen productions can kind of support each other. And I know, like, people, like a lot of writers have got really involved with this recently, like James Graham, sort of saying like a lot of the you know, there's a real kind of crossover, and there's a real you know, that one wouldn't probably happen without the other. It's like they really support each other, and just, you know, continuing to collaborate and support through what might be quite a tricky period coming out of it.
Yeah, definitely.
I think also after all of this, I think casting officers will work more collaboratively as well. I think they'll have to, and I think it would be really exciting if casting officers started sort of joining forces in a superhero Avenger-like way. It would be really exciting to see some of those minds meet. Which I think is starting to happen, was starting to happen anyway, and has always happened a bit. But I think if that's something that comes out of this, that would be really exciting.
Yeah.
And sharing assistance as well would be beneficial for everybody.
Okay, final question. Thank you for sticking with me. What is, and maybe this has kind of come up, so you might just want to reiterate, but if there was sort of one thing that you wish other people, I would say other people in the industry that might be working with you, what's one thing you wish they knew about your job and what you do?
Be great if they knew that it's impossible for us to know every actor ever. Some casting directors do, but a lot of the time people say, oh, do you know this person? It's like, maybe, but also probably not. There's far too many actors out there, and also there's an underlying assumption that you've seen every show. It'd be quite nice if people are a bit more accepting that you do go to the theatre sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. I mean, I try and only do twice a week, but you just cannot see every TV show, every production, every actor. Casting is joint, and it relies on the director and the producer to have those ideas as well. I think that's just part of the that's not you failing, not knowing who somebody is. That's you learning who somebody is. It's kind of, that's the point.
Yeah, totally. And I think also it's quite useful when people you know, people say, oh, I saw this and it was brilliant, and you know, we can learn from what we're not kind of pretending to know everything. It's just useful to know in like a, you know, if you're passionate about something, it's a nice conversation to have, rather than, you know, feeling like we should know and it's not worth discussing, if you know what I mean.
Obviously there are lots of jobs in theatre that are very tiring and time consuming, so I think it kind of goes without saying in a way, but there is that element to it, but it's also very, and you know, we've given examples of, it's very rewarding. It is a bit of a whirlwind job, and so it's not a kind of 9-to-5. But I think it's for that side of it, because I don't know about you two, but I think sometimes when you tell people that you work in casting, maybe because it's kind of that mystery thing, they're like, oh, that sounds like really glam, or like that's, oh, you get to like, and there is a really exciting side of it, but sometimes like you're so tired that you don't want to go to the press night, the really exciting party. You just want to go and say hi and like go home in the office since 8 a.m. to get in early or whatever.
Yeah,
that's quite, I mean, I don't think that's dissimilar from a lot of theatre jobs, because that's or TV or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's useful to know that before you go in.
Yeah. And hopefully when people are ringing you and emailing you and maybe have some concept of what you're dealing with on your side of the desk, I suppose, is the goal.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for doing this. It's been so interesting. Hope you guys got something out of it as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for organising it.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to watching the stage management one now.
Yeah, I know. I'm really excited
Plug.
to watch the other one.